Good evening. May I request you to put your phones on silent mode, please? Thank you. Each year, a person of eminence delivers a C.D. Deshmukh Memorial Lecture, and this year is no exception. We welcome Dr. Amitav Ghosh to deliver the 41st C.D. Deshmukh Memorial Lecture, titled Time of Monsters, Time of Possibilities, Reflections on an Interstitial Era. Now I have a rather needless task ahead of me to introduce the author. Dr. Amitav Ghosh grew up in India, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, and has a PhD in social anthropology from the University of Oxford. He is the author of 4 books of nonfiction, a collection of essays, and 9 novels. His books have won many prizes, and he holds 6 honorary doctorates. His work has been translated into more than 30 languages, and he has served on the jury of Locarno and Venice film festivals. In 2018, he became the first English language writer to receive India's highest literary honor, the Gyanpith Award. In 2024, he was awarded the Erasmus Prize and was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He is married to the writer Deborah Baker and lives in Brooklyn, New York. Our chair this evening is our President, Ambassador Shyam Saran, former Foreign Secretary. But before I ask him to deliver the welcome address, there's a book after the book, no? Oh, so then, before we proceed, I'd like Mr. Shyam Saran to release the book, Amitav Ghosh's new book, Wild Fictions. So, now, Ambassador Saran, your welcome remarks, please.
I'm sorry about the premature release of the book, but I don't think that'll make much of a difference. Good evening. Welcome to the annual C.D. Deshmukh lecture. I acknowledge the presence of our life trustees, members of the Executive Council, the Director of IISc, and its Secretary. On behalf of the IISc Board of Trustees and the very distinguished audience which is present here this evening, I wish to extend a very warm welcome to Dr. Amitav Ghosh, internationally acclaimed historian and author who kindly accepted our invitation to deliver a lecture to honor the memory of our founder president, Dr. Chintaman Dwarkanath Deshmukh, one of India's outstanding personalities who contributed to the shaping of the intellectual and cultural life of newly independent India. Dr. Deshmukh was a polyglot. He had a deep interest in philosophy, in comparative religion. He was a brilliant scholar, economist, educationist, and linguist. One of the lesser known things about him is that his academic background was not that of an economist, by which he is better known, but that of a botanist. In this, he shared some of the sensibilities of J.C. Bose, whose work on the life of plants, in fact, Amitav has written about. Dr. Deshmukh was passionate about the gardens of the IISc, which carry his stamp even today. Dr. Deshmukh brought all these multiple strains of thinking together in envisioning a very vibrant, plural, and democratic India. And the center reflects his vision as a platform for intellectual debate, cultural expression, and promotion of the free exchange of ideas amongst countries. We have tried our best to deliver on the vision he cherished for this institution. We are doubly honored as our speaker today also happens to be a distinguished and long-standing member of the IISc. So we are very happy to welcome one of our own family to deliver this lecture. And Dr. Bose has been recently awarded the prestigious Erasmus Prize by the European Union. So please join me in applauding his latest achievement and wish him many more. Now, let me just say a few words about the book we have, as I said, prematurely released. We are delighted that we have launched his latest book on this occasion, Wild Essays, which brings together several of his seminal writings penned over the last 25 years. These essays cover an extraordinary range of subjects and reflect his erudition, meticulous research, and unique perspectives which underlie all his commentaries, and above all, the passion with which he weaves together his compelling narratives. I have no doubt that Wild Essays will be as much of a bestseller as his other remarkable books have been. Congratulations, Amitabh, on the launch of Wild. The title of Amitabh's lecture this evening is Time of Monsters, Time of Possibilities, Reflections on an Interstitial Era. It is an evocative and intriguing title. It draws appropriately from the writings of the Italian Marxist philosopher Antonio Gramsci, who was also the founder of the Italian Communist Party. Gramsci lived in the tumultuous interregnum between the two world wars, which he described as a time when, and I quote, "the old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters," unquote. Of course, the monsters that Gramsci had in mind were the fascist movements in Europe of the time. They were occupying the political and ideological spaces, which were, in a sense, left vacant because of the weakened British Empire, the French, after the First World War, very destructive First World War. It may be easy to see why Amitabh considers our present as an interstitial point in history, what he himself has described as the great derangement, and therefore the time of monsters. From a geopolitical perspective, this is an age when there is, quote, a dislocated hegemon contending with her faltering contender. And I would add many other powers jostling in between. But Amitabh also sees our age as an age of possibilities. This may be, at first sight, less persuasive as we witness runaway technological advance, in particular artificial intelligence, blurring the distinction between the real and the virtual, and when the very notion of being human is being shaken to the core. But I'm sure that Amitabh will be able to tell us why he remains optimistic about the human condition. I think the possibilities he has in mind would be very different from those which artificial intelligence evangelists seduce us with. In any event, we look forward to a most stimulating interaction this evening with one of the most probing and perspective thinkers of our time. I will now invite Amitabh to please deliver his lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shyam, for that very generous introduction. I have to say it's an enormous pleasure for me to be here at the IISc, and thank you all for coming. This place has played a very important part in my intellectual life. Throughout my college years and afterwards, the IISc was the only place where you could go really for any kind of exchange of ideas, and so it's played a very major part in my life. So I was, it was very wonderful to be asked to deliver this lecture. And I'd like to begin by thanking Mr. Shyam Saran for inviting me to do this, especially because this lecture is named after a towering figure in Indian finance and economics, a man who left an indelible mark on the nation's economic landscape. As India's first finance minister, C.D. Deshmukh navigated the challenges of the post-independence era, laying the foundations for India's future development. However, Deshmukh's legacy transcends national boundaries. He was a key participant in the historic Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, which played a very important role in defining the era that is now lurching towards its end. This era is indeed the subject of many of the essays in my book, in my just released book, Wild Fictions, which is a collection of pieces written over the last quarter century and slightly more, actually. When I think back to my work over the last 25 years, I feel that what characterizes it most of all is the sense of bearing witness to a rupture in time, of chronicling the passing of an era that began 300 years ago in the 18th century. This was, of course, the period that saw the birth of modernity and industrial civilization, in which, under the leadership of the British Empire, the West tightened its grip over most of the world, culminating ultimately in the emergence of the United States as the planet's sole superpower. Starting from the collapse of the Soviet Union, the unipolar moment peaked at the turn of the millennium and then ran into a series of profound shocks starting in 2001. In the summer of 2001, I was scheduled to deliver a lecture in Colombo in memory of Neelan Tiruchelvam, the eminent Sri Lankan lawyer who had emerged in the course of the country's long civil war as the most prominent liberal voice within the Tamil community. As a voice of moderation, Tiruchelvam was a target for extremists, particularly for the liberation tigers of Tamil Eelam, and his life ended tragically in a gruesome car bombing on July 29, 1999. My talk was scheduled for the second anniversary of Neelan Tiruchelvam's death, but 5 days before that date, on July 24, 2001, the LTTE carried out what was then the boldest and most spectacular act of terrorism that the world had yet seen until then. 14 suicide commandos attacked Colombo's international airport, killing 7 soldiers and destroying or damaging 26 aircraft, including several fighter jets. The next day, pictures of the airport with burned and crippled planes strewn across the runways appeared on TV and computer screens around the world. The next few days passed in great uncertainty for me because I didn't know whether I would be able to travel to Colombo or not. I was determined to go if at all possible because I felt that this was a time when it was urgently necessary to remember a man like Neelan Tiruchelvam. Fortunately, flights resumed over the intervening days, so I was able to travel to Colombo as planned. And I remember vividly the spectacle that greeted me when my plane landed. The burnt-out shells of planes and helicopters were littered everywhere, and some of them had even melted into the tarmac. That airport was not new to me. I had lived in Colombo as a child in the 1960s, when Sri Lanka was the most advanced nation in the Indian subcontinent, with the highest literacy rates, the best health services, and so on. To look around that airport with its charred wreckage was to know that the teleology that had sustained modernity, with its promises of never-ending growth and progress, were delusions. 6 weeks later, on September 11th, 2001, I was in Brooklyn with my family. It was an important day for us because it was the beginning of the school year, and my 10-year-old daughter, Leela, was joining a new school, one that happened to face the World Trade Center from across the East River and Lower Manhattan. Early that morning, my wife dropped Leela off on her way to work and then went on to her workplace. So when the attacks began, my wife was a long way away in Midtown Manhattan. Meanwhile, I was at home with my 8-year-old son, Nayan. So when the city's schools began to shut down, we set off together to bring my daughter home. I held Nayan's hand all the way, because it would have been easy for us to be swept apart by the streams of people that were now pouring over the Brooklyn Bridge. The crowds included many people who worked in the financial districts of Manhattan. Their expensive business clothes were now coated with gray dust, and they were walking as if in a daze, stupefied by what they had seen. But they were the lucky ones. Later that day, we would find out that our friend and neighbor in Brooklyn, Frank DeMartini, was among the missing. I wrote an essay about Frank DeMartini just after 9/11, and it's a part of this collection. When we finally found Leela in the crowded foyer of her school, the first words she uttered were, "Baba, I saw it all through the windows of my history class." This turned out to be true. My daughter and her classmates had watched the attacks on the Twin Towers through a schoolroom window. Unlike Leela and many other New Yorkers, I did not witness the attacks of 9/11 with my own eyes. Yet on that day, I felt that I was watching another turn in a cycle of history that I had observed from many different angles: India, the United States, and the Middle East. 20 years before, as a doctoral student in anthropology, I had done my fieldwork in a couple of villages in Egypt's Beira province. I had been back several times since then and had observed the emergence of many ominous portents. I've written about this in my book, In an Antique Land, and I write about it also in a couple of the pieces here. Now, it was as if this history had followed me to New York and detonated on my doorstep with devastating force. This uncanny feeling deepened when I learned that Muhammad Atta, the leader of the 9/11 attack teams, hailed from the same region where I had done my fieldwork in Egypt. Indeed, his ancestral village was closely connected with the places where I had worked. It was then that I understood that the world was now entering a time of monsters, as Antonio Gramsci famously put it, when an old era is dying and a new one is struggling to be born. But the monsters that Gramsci had in mind were purely political creatures, mainly fascists. What is distinctive about our time is that its monsters also consist of weather events that would have been thought of as improbable or freakish in Gramsci's lifetime: supercharged storms, mega droughts, catastrophic rain bombs, runaway wildfires, and the like. Back then, in Gramsci's lifetime, these monsters would have been considered natural phenomena or acts of God. But knowing what we now know about anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions and their role in intensifying climate disasters, it is no longer possible to cling to the fiction of a strict division between the natural and the political. Wildfires, rain bombs, and the like are also deeply political creatures, in that they are the byproducts of historical processes that have hugely benefited a small minority of human beings at the expense of the great majority of the world's population. The same could be said about the policies and administrative actions through which landscapes have come to be divided between the natural and the social. This is indeed the theme of the essay from which the title of my new book is taken, Wild Fictions. For me, the second millennium dawned with the launching of a new project which would ultimately become a novel, The Hungry Tide. The book is set in the Sundarban, and it was in doing the background research for the novel that I began to think seriously about climate change and environmental disasters. Indeed, the novel's climactic scenes occur during a cyclone that sent a great wall of water surging through the mangrove forest. The Hungry Tide was published in the summer of 2004. On the 25th of December that year, I arrived in Kolkata on a family visit. The next morning, sleepy and jet-lagged, I opened my computer and was jolted rudely awake by horrifying images of a tsunami triggered by an undersea earthquake centered off the west coast of Sumatra. The Sundarban was one of the areas that was swamped by the Great Wave. Although the wave in the Hungry Tide is not a tsunami, but a cyclonic storm surge, it still felt as though a scene that had played out in my head over and over again was suddenly being actualized in the real world. In fact, Gopal Gandhi, who is here today, was then the governor of Bengal. And he called me that day and said, it's almost like you knew it was going to happen. And of course, I didn't know. But you know, there's an element of the uncanny in writing fiction. And it often happens that one sees things like that playing out in real life. Anyway, the thought of this was so unsettling that I felt compelled to travel to one of the worst affected areas, the Nicobar Islands. That's again something that I wrote a long essay about it for The Hindu, which is also included in this collection. 7 months later, when Hurricane Katrina struck New Orleans, I was in Mauritius on a research trip. Watching the disaster unfold from the perspective of a small island nation was weirdly illuminating. Mauritius happens to be located in a notorious cyclone alley and is frequently hit by powerful storms. Yet cyclone-related deaths are very rare on that island because the population has grown extremely proficient in coping with major storms. My Mauritian friends, as I describe in another piece in this book, were astounded to observe the utter ineptitude of the world's sole hyperpower, long vaunted as the most advanced nation on earth in dealing with the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. I was reminded then of the overcrowded barracoon, V.S. Naipaul's essay on Mauritius, in which he depicts the island as backward, overpopulated, and teetering on the brink of collapse. Always implicit in Naipaul's judgments were comparisons with the affluent countries of the West, which in his thinking represented the higher standards of good governance. Now it was as if the heavens themselves had intervened to prove Naipaul wrong. The stunning incompetence with which Hurricane Katrina was handled suggested that over many years of neoliberal governance, the capabilities of the American state had been massively eroded. Indeed, Hurricane Katrina was not primarily an environmental disaster. Rather, it was an example of what Christian Parenti calls a catastrophic convergence, a collision between a climatic event and social and historical factors like crumbling infrastructure, poverty, patterns of terraforming, governmental neglect, and a structural racism. This seemed to me yet another sign that the era of Euro-centered modernity was ending, and that the West could no longer be thought of as setting the highest standards for good governance and political sagacity. This impression would be confirmed again and again over the following years, during which the United States repeatedly sought to demonstrate its omnipotence as the world's sole hyperpower. But every one of the projects that it undertook during this time, for example, the occupations of Afghanistan and Iraq, ended in failure, ultimately rebounding on the West. A good example is the so-called European migrant crisis, which started after the intensification of the Syrian civil war in 2011. As tens of thousands of refugees from Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq poured into Germany and other European countries, migration became an explosive political issue, destabilizing governments and contributing substantially to Britain's exit from the European Union. Today, the issue of migration continues to roil politics in the West, leading to an upsurge in support for demagogues and right-wing movements. Driving the ascendancy of these neo-fascist movements is a myth of victimhood, in which affluent countries are seen as the aggrieved parties resisting invasions by black and brown foreigners. Yet the fact is that the preconditions for these mass migrations were created by none other than the West itself, with the multiple invasions and regime change operations that it launched across the world, while it was reveling in the delirium of the unipolar moment. The Cold War ended so abruptly and in such a fashion that the American political class came to be convinced that the US had achieved absolute and permanent geopolitical supremacy and that its paramountcy would never again be challenged. This, combined with the booming successes of Silicon Valley, created a hubris in the United States, and indeed in the collective West, that surpassed anything that had existed even in the glory days of European imperialism. American politicians and pundits, along with their epigones in Europe and the Anglosphere, decided that they had a duty to impose their will wherever they wanted for whatever reason. The result was a swath of destruction that stretched from Afghanistan and Pakistan to Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and Libya. NATO's bombing of Libya is a particularly egregious example of the short-sightedness of Western actions in this period. Libya was host to hundreds of thousands of Asian and African migrants. After the government collapsed and the country descended into civil war, these workers had nowhere to go except across the Mediterranean. Did none of NATO's leaders, with all the collective wisdom of their pundits and think tanks, see this coming? Their pronouncements from that time suggest that they did not. Hillary Clinton, for example, gloated after the death of Muammar Gaddafi. We came, we saw, he died. Pronouncements like these suggest that the minds of Western leaders had been so addled by hubris that they thought that their actions would never have any consequences. Yet, this hubris did not arise out of nothing. The truth is that in the 30 years between 1990 and 2020, the West's paramountcy in the world came to be cemented to a degree that was without precedent in human history. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the West, spearheaded by the Anglosphere, no longer had any significant rivals or challenges, either militarily or ideologically. This was a situation that had never existed before. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, European empires had to confront continuous challenges from the Ottoman, Chinese, and Russian states, as well as other alliances and kingdoms like those of the Marathas in India. Moreover, the West was also continuously at war with itself, especially in the 20th century. This meant that there was no single power that could exert absolute dominance at any time, even for decades after the Second World War. In a sense, then, the fall of the Berlin Wall was the outcome that all of the dominant political tendencies in the West, ranging from liberals and conservatives to fascists, had sought ever since the Russian Revolution. And one of the principal reasons for their unbending hostility to the USSR was that the very fact of the existence of the Soviet Union lent a powerful impetus to the other great historical process that was set in motion by the Second World War, which is decolonization. As Pankaj Mishra points out in his recent book, The World After Gaza, there are good reasons, I quote, to consider that the most consequential event of the 20th century might not be the First or Second World War, the Shoah, the Cold War, or for that matter, the collapse of communism, but decolonization. In other words, 1990 marked a turning point in two different and contradictory historical trajectories. On the one hand, Western imperial power, having been set in motion in the 16th century by the Spanish and Portuguese empires, reached its absolute zenith under the continuing leadership of the Anglosphere. But it was at this time also that the process of decolonization, which had gone through a period of extreme precarity and uncertainty, was also able to consolidate itself in countries like China, India, and Indonesia. What we are witnessing today is a head-on collision between these two contradictory and opposed historical impulses: imperial paramountcy on the one hand and decolonization on the other. The first dynamic allowed a tiny minority of the world's population to siphon off a hugely disproportionate share of the Earth's endowments at the expense of the majority, including often many of their own citizens. The second countervailing impulse has now led to an enormous expansion in the economies of the global south, though also often at the expense of many of their own people. This is what makes this a time of such radical uncertainty. As the American strategist George Kennan famously pointed out almost 80 years ago, the fundamental challenge that now confronts the United States, and indeed the collective West, is that of preserving their hold on a vastly disproportionate share of the world's wealth. But what made this disparity possible was the enormous gap in military tactics and technology that opened up between the imperial core and the periphery over centuries of colonialism. Today, even though the West is responsible for 75% of the world's military spending, this gap is closing fast, and in many respects has already closed. Now, even an impoverished country like Yemen can disrupt global trade with a few homemade missiles. The leadership of the collective West is therefore now burdened with the Sisyphean task of pursuing the fundamentally unachievable goal of maintaining its hold on a vastly disproportionate share of the world's resources. Yet, it is becoming increasingly clear that the goal, unachievable though it is, will not be abandoned. And if it should prove to be the case that the only means of preserving the West's historic advantages is by sowing chaos throughout the world, then so be it. It is not hard to predict, however, that ultimately this chaos will also return to haunt the West, as it has already repeatedly done since the start of the millennium. Here lies the most monstrous aspect of this age of monsters. As I have argued in my book, The Nutmeg's Curse, the military sector is one of the most important drivers of climate change. And yet, as the wars in Ukraine, Gaza, and Syria have shown, when it comes to matters of geopolitics, every other consideration is swept aside. And nowhere more so than in the countries that profess to be concerned about climate change. And ironically, these are none other than the status quo powers of the West, which also happen to be responsible for the vast bulk of the world's military spending. I observed earlier that we are now in a time between the ending of one epoch and the birth of another, a time of monsters, in the words of Antonio Gramsci. The strange thing about this interstitial era, however, is that it could also be described as a time of possibilities, in that it has suddenly become possible to contemplate and even embrace potentialities that were denied or rejected during the age of high modernity. For example, the idea that plants might possess something akin to intelligence, that rocks might be sentient, that rivers might be regarded as persons, that certain topographical features might possess qualities and attributes that cannot be reduced to their geological composition. Such vitalist conceptions have been widely prevalent in human cultures since the infancy of our species, and they still continue to exist in many different forms across the world. It was only after the beginning of the early modern era, when a tiny group of elite European men invented a philosophy in which sentience, thought, reason, and historical agency were ascribed solely to human beings. It was only then that vitalist beliefs came to be contested, denied, and suppressed, often with extreme violence. Over the following centuries, with the Western conquest of most of the world, this kind of human-centeredness has become a core component of elite ideologies everywhere. Today, as the planet hurtles towards environmental and social collapse brought about by the interlinked vectors of global warming, biodiversity loss, species extinctions, and the spread of new pathogens, it has become evident that modernity was founded on a profoundly mistaken understanding of the world, and that the elevation of humans above all other species and indeed above the earth itself, has played an essential part in bringing about the current planetary crisis. The discrediting of modernity's anthropocentrism is itself a part of the ongoing collapse that we are now witnessing. Now that it has belatedly begun to dawn on us that there is much to be learnt from pre-modern ideas and understandings, the earth suddenly seems to teem with sentience. Everything seems to have a spirit, a soul, not just trees and plants, but also leaves, blades of grass, and so on. This is the point where we begin to step back in alarm. Would it be at all possible to exist in a world where everything is sentient? Would I be able to get out of bed in the morning if I thought that my houseplants were talking about me? This is why it's important to remember that vitalist understandings of the earth are not incompatible with doubt and skepticism. Indeed, and there should be no mistake about this, the default position of humanity in relation to the vital qualities of the more than human world is not belief or credulity or superstition, it is doubt. I noted earlier that most human beings throughout history were open to the possibility of non-human vitality. This does not mean, however, that people uncritically accepted every story they were told about trees that talk and birds that communicate. As Niels Boebant has shown in his fine study of witchcraft on the Malukan island of Halmahera, even though the islanders allow for the possibility that certain kinds of actions can be effected by supernatural means, each particular instance of such an action is subjected to very critical scrutiny. The critical faculty is by no means specific to modernity. It is the conceptual prism through which people make their peace with a world that actually does teem with sentience. This is a necessary condition of human existence, because if we did not regard the non-human world with a certain degree of disbelief, we might well lose our minds. Humans have never, for instance, wanted farmers to tell them about their conversations with their trees, nor did they want goat herders to talk about their communications with their animals. And if those people did talk about such things, they were met with derision and laughter. No one took them seriously. The only domains of human culture where doubt is held in suspension are poetry and fiction. So, for example, if someone tells a story or recites a poem about ghosts, aliens, or talking trees, even though we may not believe in the literal truth of their tales, we listen anyway. This is because stories and poems unfold within the realm of the subjunctive, where certain otherworldly potentialities might be said to exist even if they could not be verified. That is why there is no better way of imagining the possibility of non-human sentience than through stories and poems. This was something that Acharya Jagadish Chandra Bose, the first scientist to systematically study plant sentience, understood very well. As is well known, Jagadish Chandra Bose was a Bengali physicist who did pioneering work on electricity and magnetism, leading to the development of the coherer, a highly sensitive instrument which played an important role in Guglielmo Marconi's invention of wireless telegraphy. Bose's contributions to wireless communication were widely recognized, and he was awarded the Royal Society's Medal in 1900. However, Bose's true passion lay in the study of plant life. He believed that plants possessed a form of sentience and that they could respond to stimuli much like animals do. To investigate this hypothesis, he devised ingenious experiments that measured the electrical responses of plants to various stimuli, such as light, touch, and sound. Using innovative devices of his own invention, one of which was called the crescograph, Bose showed that plants emit electrical impulses that are strikingly similar to those of animals. He demonstrated also that plants can experience stress and fatigue, and that they can even die from shock. Bose was, of course, doing this work at the start of the 20th century, when high modernity was in the ascendant. His findings ran so much against the grain of the prevalent materialist dogmas that they were met with shock and astonishment in Europe. Though they initially occasioned a flurry of interest and even acclaim, eventually, I quote, "the dominant style of science in the modern West, with its positivist emphasis on manipulation, control, prediction, and power, took its revenge." I'm quoting from Ashish Nandi, in fact. And Bose's findings came to be dismissed as the work of a charlatan. In India, however, Acharya Jagadish Chandra Bose continued to be revered, perhaps because the idea that plants were sentient seemed like simple common sense to most Indians. Today, Bose stands vindicated, and the subject of plant sentience is now a burgeoning field of study among scientists. A significant number of botanists have even come to be convinced that trees possess the ability to communicate with each other in a fashion that is very similar to talking. Although Bose never went quite that far, he did write a short piece in Bengali called Gachher Kotha, which could be translated as tree talk. It's a sort of beautifully ambiguous title. This is how it begins. I quote, "Do trees say anything? Many will ask, what sort of question is that? Have trees ever had anything to say? But do humans always express everything they want to say? And that which they do not express, is that not worth speaking of? We have a boy at home who cannot express everything he wants to say. And the few things he does say are said in such a broken and incomplete way that those who don't know him cannot understand what he means. But we, on the other hand, can understand everything he says. And not just that. There are many things that our boy doesn't express verbally, but does so instead through movements of his eyes, mouth, and hands, or by gesturing and shaking his head. And we, who know him, can understand all of this, while others can't. One day, a pigeon from our neighbor's house flew over and perched on our house. Then it began to sing with all its might. This was our boy's first meeting with the pigeon, and he began to imitate its song. Why does a pigeon sing? It sings when it wants, when it's happy or sad, and even sometimes in its own mind, silently. Learning the skill gave the boy no end of joy. One day I came home and found the boy very ill. His head was aching and he was lying in bed with his eyes closed. The playful child who would disturb the whole household with his antics could not even open his eyes today. I seated myself beside his bed and started to stroke his head. The boy recognized my touch and with great difficulty opened his eyes and looked at me. Then he sang the pigeon's song. I heard many things in this song. I understood that he was saying, "Have you come to see your son? He loves you very much." I understood many other things too that I cannot express in words. You might ask, how could you have heard so many things in the song of a pigeon? The answer is, because I loved the boy. You will have seen for yourselves that by looking at a boy's face, his mother understands what he wants. Often there is no need for words. Where there is love, many possibilities can be seen, many things can be heard. High modernity taught us that the earth was inert and existed only to be exploited by human beings for their own purposes. In this time of possibilities, we are slowly beginning to understand that in order to hear the earth, we must first love it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amitabh. I'm sure that everyone here will agree that this was really one of the most outstanding lectures we have heard in memory of Dr. C.D. Deshmukh. It's rather surprising that somebody who's a scientist, which J.C. Bose was, It is difficult to reconcile what he wrote in this story with, supposedly his acclaim as a scientist, a rationalist. So you end the lecture by talking about the importance of love, and I agree that love creates the kind of possibilities that you are talking about, but one doesn't see much of love around us these days.
No.
So there is a problem that hate seems to sell much more, drive people much more than perhaps love seems to. Yeah, I do really believe that when I said that you are perhaps an optimist in the kind of current situation that we face, that, where does one create those possibilities of love? And of course, how does one love an earth that is being ravaged, almost daily before our eyes?
Well, I think you're probably the only person in the world who thinks of me as an optimist. Because the way, when I look around myself, I mean, I think things are just getting worse and worse, and we can see it's not even a question of the way things are right now, it's a question of the trajectory, it's the trajectory which looks really, really grim. And the reason that the trajectory looks so grim is precisely this, that what high modernity taught us was really to pay no heed to the world around us, to other beings, to the rest of the world. And I think that, if we are going to make any peace with what is around us, it would have to be by a process of unlearning, of uneducating ourselves into the ideologies that have been communicated to us through,
Yeah, so we know what to do. We know what the answer is. The question is, how do we get to that point? You have spoken about the interstitial age that we are living in, and as I mentioned, that this draws from Gramsci's work. And he was living in an interregnum as well. One might say that virtually every generation thinks that its own age is an interstitial age. This is not something that is completely novel, although every generation thinks that what it is going through is unprecedented. But we see through history that there have been many such phases in history. While recognizing that, you also seem to think that there is something fundamentally different about the disruption that we see happening today. What is that particular element that you see as distinctive in this particular? Is it climate change, for example, or is it something else? You have not spoken at all here about artificial intelligence. But here is another dystopian world that is perhaps being created as well. So what is it that you see as really distinctive and really unprecedented in our age of change?
Well, as you say, it has happened many times before that human beings or particular groups of human beings have lived through the ending of their world. This was true for many Native American groups whose worlds were really brought to a very violent end by their confrontations with colonizers. And sometimes, the ending of a world happened very suddenly. I mean, I've described one such in my book, The Nutmeg's Curse, where the Banda Islands were literally, the people of the Banda Islands were exterminated in the course of a few weeks. So others have lived through this particular sense of a world coming to an end. So we are not definitely the first to go through that. And I think we can learn from those people who saw that. But I think what is different now, and I wouldn't say it's climate change, because, as Margaret Atwood famously said, it's not just climate change, it's everything change. So that's what we're seeing. I think it's a mistake to think that we are living in a period of just one axis of disaster, There are various interlinked axes of disasters. That's why I don't even talk about climate change. I think one has to speak of the planetary crisis, because there's, biodiversity loss, which is perhaps an even greater threat than climate change, because, if all the bees disappear, there's nothing going to be left for us to eat. There's biodiversity loss, there's, the species extinctions, and there are so many other, the new pathogens that are sort of whirling around the world. So we can see that there are all these kinds of threats that are arising. You mentioned artificial intelligence, but the top brass in Silicon Valley, that's not the only thing they're worried about. They're all preparing for something that they call the event. Which is why they've created these getaway bunkers, on little islands here and there. So they're completely agnostic as to the cause, of the event, which they visualize as a complete collapse. So they think of runaway artificial intelligence being one vector of this, but they also think of many other things like runaway nanobots. That's one thing they're really scared of. They're also really terrified of something called the grey goo scenario, which is runaway nanobots, which create this kind of voracious mud that eats everything up. So there are many things to be scared of, And for now, really, I'm not that scared of artificial intelligence. I just wish artificial intelligence could get my name right, Half the time it doesn't.
Yeah. Well, from that, let me really focus attention on the ecological crisis that we face today. As you have hinted that, there are, it's in a sense a polycrisis, but there is a polycrisis within a polycrisis in the ecological field. And what you see today is that biodiversity loss, feedback loops with climate change. Just today there was a report from the World Meteorological Organization that last year was the hottest year on record, and 2025 is going to be even hotter than 2024. So there is no doubt that all these things are gathering together to create what may be called a perfect storm. What is it that you ascribe this, what I would say almost a collective blindness about? Because it is there, it is no longer something which may happen in the future. It is no longer something that you only sort of theoretically are trying to visualize. It is something which is happening here and now. Certainly no sign of loving the earth. But what is it that explains this kind of collective blindness? Because people are talking about it, scientists are talking about it, sociologists are talking about the impact that is taking place on societies, on individuals, and yet there seems to be a remarkable sort of complacency about what is facing us.
I think there's an old saying about don't take people at their word. Watch what they do. And I think that's what we really have to do. I mean, and I've been looking at, quite carefully at the sorts of statements that come out of, especially Silicon Valley, and because these are the people who now literally control our world. And I think if you read between the lines, you can see very well that it's not that they don't have a plan. They do have a plan, and catastrophe is the plan. They think that essentially, the reason that they think in this way is that they think that when the event happens, that the great majority of the people who will die are people in the global south, they're poor, black and brown people, that in effect, they're really thinking of the event as an exterminatory event. Because many of them are really, this theme of extermination runs through a lot of Western thought. And I think what we are really seeing is, as it were, the reemergence of a sort of exterminatory impulse, in this. So they really believe that, they're going to wipe half the world out while they're lurking in their bunkers. Then after, what they call a Malthusian correction, they'll come out and take the world over again. But I think this, what really fascinates me about this is the sheer childishness of this idea. Because, in the event of a global collapse, in the event of the collapse of all systems, who is likely to survive? I certainly don't think it's a bunch of people who are used to staring at screens all day long. The people who will survive, if you ask me, are the people who manage to stay away from the developmental state, who've managed to, as it were, preserve their native forms of resilience. I really believe that.
Yeah. So, if there is a stream of thinking in the West that somehow you can create catastrophe and then after a certain lapse you can emerge as once again dominant in the world. The notion that somehow this is something which the blacks and the browns are going to be affected by or will be wiped out. You see every day, in fact, the notion that the West is somehow insulated from the impact of climate change is proving to be wrong. I mean, what better evidence do you need than Hollywood burning, in Los Angeles? Or what has happened before in, say, Australia with the large, tracts of forest just having been destroyed. So the sense that somehow, this is something which is a problem of the blacks and the browns is simply not true. And with respect to having the instruments with which you can perhaps, exterminate, if that is what is the aim. Today, you at least have some blacks and browns who seem to have also mastered many of those instruments of which potentially can also exterminate. So I'm not quite sure how this kind of a notion can in fact be sustained in any way.
Unfortunately, I think the elites of the global south have also completely, adopted this ideology. They completely believe that that they themselves will not suffer, whereas, their poor, Dalit countrymen and so on are the ones who are going to be wiped out. And here I think they're absolutely wrong. Because, you can just look at it empirically. Who are the people who are likely to be worst affected by these disasters? I've presented a scenario in my book, The Great Derangement. In the event of a cyclone hitting Mumbai, who are the most exposed? The most exposed people are, in fact, the middle classes. Because the middle class people cannot evacuate from a city like Bombay. In the first place, to evacuate a city like Bombay is almost impossible. There are only two major, overland routes, and those are almost always clogged with traffic. Only a small number can evacuate by boat, but most of all, middle-class people will not evacuate in countries like India or the United States because your middle-class person's entire being is wrapped up in their real estate and in their cars. So they can't, so we've seen this repeatedly in Houston, in Florida, and so on, that most people refuse to evacuate.
True. So let me ask the last question, and I want this to be about our own country, about India. In terms of this ecological crisis, it is worth looking at what our traditional culture or what our ancient texts have talked about. Nature is not a dark force to be conquered and to be, yoked to human greed or human need, but it is a source of nurture. That it is, you look at it as a mother, not as an insentient, dark force, as I said, to be conquered. So that notion is very much there, that you must not take away from your mother more than she needs to regenerate herself. And she's inexhaustible in that sense. She is able to regenerate. So there is that notion of sustainability, which we keep talking about, but you have actually a very deeply ingrained notion of sustainability in this culture, which we have, in a sense, strayed away from. That is one aspect. How do we recapture that? When you're talking about loving the earth, that is what love of the earth, in a sense, means. Second thing that I talked about, which is linked to this, is what I saw when you talked about, Ramanujam and his, 300 Ramayans. And you mentioned the fact that somehow it has been taken off the curriculum, that there should not be 300 Ramayans, there is only perhaps only one Ramayan. And you say that, if he were told about this today, he would be somewhat mildly amused by the utter futility of this impulse. For at this very moment at which plural vision of the epics was being violently opposed, hundreds of new retellings of the epics in which the gods and heroes are presented in distinctly contemporary guises were rising to the top of the bestseller charts. So, it is I actually see this as a matter of optimism that, ultimately the drive to bring about homogeneity, the drive to put a monochromatic frame over what is immense plurality is ultimately a fool's endeavor. And that is perhaps the best thing that one can hope as far as the future is concerned.
Well, I hope you're right about that. I would like to believe that as well. But I must say that I've lost any faith, what you were saying before, that our culture can work to, as it were, serve as an insulating factor against other. The problem with this extractive capitalist ideology is that it's incredibly, it spreads incredibly fast. And once it spreads, it gets very, very deep inside people. So if I think back to my childhood, it was ingrained in us not to waste things. I mean, if you left the fan going or the lights going, you were punished. We were always taught never to take, credit is the worst thing. I mean, you should never. And look at it now. I mean, I think young Indians, they have the same mindset as young Westerners. I remember when I first went to the United States, I would see a single person driving in a car. And I said to myself, this will never happen in India. If there's a car, there'll be 10 people in it. But it has happened, It's completely happened. Or if you think about, who are the people who are doing this incredibly destructive mining, Of course, there are the miners, but who are the people behind it? Most of the time, the vegetarians, who won't even hurt, an insect. So in what way does the culture serve as an insulating force? I've lost any belief that I may have had in that.
Yeah. So I really wonder why you said that this was a time of possibilities. I think if you have 10 to 15 minutes, can we take a few questions from the audience? I'll take 3 questions, and then I will ask Amitabh to answer. Please state your name and also make your question very short. Please avoid commentaries. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, there is a mic.
This is taking time, by the way. Quickly, because this is. Yes, one of the things that is. Can you hear me now?
Yes, it's very difficult to switch this mic on for some reason.
Just do it, please. It's taking like a long time. Yeah, okay. One thing that is consistent with what you've said, but it seems to be a part of what brings the kind of age of monsters that you're talking of. You didn't mention it, and I thought I would bring it up. One is inequality and the way it is increasing. And the second is the way the system is increasingly unresponsive in the way that it was supposedly designed to be responsive. So these are the two things. So you've talked about the other end of it was Silicon Valley building their bunkers and all of that, which implies that this sort of thing is happening. So maybe this is a stepping stone on the way and part of the process that creates this age of monsters, inequality and unresponsiveness. Okay.
Okay. Yes, please. I'll come to you.
I've read all your books, and I think you're a national treasure.
Oh, thank you.
Will you please identify
I'm
yourself?
Sagari Chabra. I made a film on global warming in 1989, and my boss told me that climate change doesn't exist. I'm glad you receive a better reception. I want to say one thing, that earlier, in India, we had a different model of development. As of late, we have copied that Western model of modernity whole hog. We are proud to become a trillion economy. How we do it is another story. What I want to say is this, that some individuals, not many, whoever is raising these questions of what's happening on the ground are either getting income tax notices, either they are being raided by the ED, or they are being arrested under the UAPA. I would like you to respond to that. How does a human being react to what's happening when it's not just the climate that is changing? Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead. Please stand up so that he can see who wants to.
Shastri Ramchandran. I'm a fan of your writings, and I've read most of them. I have just one question. We are regressing in many ways, going to pre-constitutional state, pre-modern state, and a lot of atavistic things. So when you speak of how we may have to fall back on pre-modern ideas, could you give one single illustration or example of what you have in mind when you say that we may have to fall back on pre-modern ideas? Thank you.
Okay. Would you like to?
Yes. Well, first, the issue of inequality, yes, I think that's absolutely the case. Inequality is the monster at the heart of all this. Most of all, how shall I say, geopolitical inequalities are so clearly at the heart of this, problem. Yes, look, you're absolutely right. I mean, 100 years ago, Mahatma Gandhi said famously that, we will never adopt the Western way of doing these things because if 300 million, there were only 300 million of us then. If 300 million Indians adopt this way of living, we'll eat up the world like locusts. Nobody would dare to say that today. I mean, everyone has now accepted, a certain model of growth-driven economy. So that's one of the strangest ironies of all this, that in the period of colonization, there were actually contestations of Western ideas in a way that no longer exists. Those contestations hardly exist. I mean, they do exist in pockets, but they've more or less disappeared. So it's not just India. It's the same in Africa, Indonesia, everywhere. It's the same model that's been just adopted wholesale. And that's why I think it's very hard to see anything good coming out of the trajectories that we see in the world right now. What you said about pre-modern ideas. So, I think one has to look at them in every instance, So, for example, in the Bengal Delta, going back, to the late 19th century, under British colonization, the British hated the idea of a lack of fixity. So in this landscape, which is sort of seasonally mud and water, where there's never any fixity of the soil, where it's constantly sort of reverting back and forth, they wanted to push it all into place. So they came up with the idea of creating this vast network of embankments. And actually we now find that in retrospect, the ways that people handled floods before was completely different. It was a much better way of living with floods. You can't actually control water. But again, this essentially colonial approach to dealing with estuarine landscapes was adopted wholesale by the governments in first East Pakistan, then in Bangladesh. So they completely accepted this idea. So it was a kind of auto-colonization, you might say. And they brought in Dutch experts, for example. Now, the Rhine Delta receives 1% of the silt of the Ganges-Brahmaputra Delta. How can you apply solutions that are thought up in relation to Holland? Just the scale is so different. So, now certainly in Bangladesh, you do see patterns where they're reverting to dealing with water in a completely different way, as they used to before, so that water is not held in place, where it suppresses fertility and so on. So I think there are a lot of things to be learned from them. The use of fire, in controlling forests, which indigenous Australians used and also Native Americans used, and whose traditional knowledge was almost wiped out. So I think all across the world we are beginning to see that there were ways of dealing with these challenges which our ancestors understood much better than we do.
Yeah. Okay, please.
Hello. This been
Please identify yourself.
Shudeep Sen. A lot of talk of doom and gloom. I want to bring the discussion back to hope, because you do talk about that in the book. And I'm glad that you read the beautiful translation of Jagdish Chandra Bose's story of the pigeon and the boy. Why is it that the axis of disasters, or the vectors of disasters you're talking about and we know of, is so viciously promulgated, when in fact the threads of sentience which you talk about is linked from the axis of the ancient and the current world, and it's not a new idea. We have the knowledge, the ancient people have the knowledge. Why is it that an entity like modernity could dispel and destroy it? I'm just incredibly surprised. I want your view on it, please.
Yeah.
Good evening, sir. I just wanted to ask you if you're familiar. I'm Aisha Malik. If you're familiar with the works of Zygmunt Bauman and his work on liquid modernity, do you think that the way forward from this epoch that we find in is through solid modernity or liquid as a path to make improvements?
Okay. One. There.
Hi, Dr. Ghosh. I'm Shalini, and I'm a journalist working for the Third Pole. You discussed the billboard incident in Mumbai last year, and this is something you predicted in your book, The Great Derangement. Is it frustrating for you as a writer to see that there's so much potential in literature on climate change that can inform policies, and you still do not see that happening? How do you deal with that frustration?
Okay. How do you deal with that frustration?
It's not very frustrating for me, because I've long since abandoned any idea that our policymakers are guided by reason or rationality or any kind of even common sense. I think if you look around the world, it's perfectly clear that they're not. I mean, they're the real carriers of derangement, if you like. But it does happen that it does happen often. There is something uncanny about the whole process of writing fiction. So, for example, after the tsunami, Gopal called me and said, "How did you know that this was going to happen?" And similarly, in my book, Gun Island, I write about a wildfire in Los Angeles, that's coming towards the Getty Museum. And actually, exactly that happened. But I wrote that chapter months before it actually happened. So one often has these strange sorts of inklings or whatever you like. I mean, that, you know. Anyway, so yeah, I don't think that our policymakers are going to be guided by any kind of common sense. The second question was about, yes. Why is it so easy to suppress the knowledge of a sentient Earth? It's very easily answered because because the idea of an Earth as an inert system that can be manipulated to your advantage can be enormously to your advantage. You can make a lot of money off it. You can use it to create certain kinds of dominions, if you like. You can use it to attack other people, to displace people, which is what happened in North America, for example. The creation of dams continuously displaced indigenous peoples. The Earth responds slowly. You know, there's a difference in time between human time and you know, the time of the environment. So by the time it comes around, that you know, the non-human responds. Already, the people who've profited from manipulating the Earth get away with it. You know, so it seems as if they were right, but they were not. You know, it's just that you know, there's a lag. So, for example, the way they built Los Angeles, it's entirely guided by profit motives. Everybody always knew that you couldn't, that you should not be building in these places. Just as everybody knows that in Chennai you shouldn't be shutting down all the drainage channels, and that if you do that every time there's a rain bomb event, you'll have this catastrophic flood. Everybody knows that, and yet the real estate industries are so powerful they can override all kinds of political constraints. And your question was now
modernity.
Yes. Look, one thing I think we have to abandon is this kind of universalist approach to things, you know. Everything must be geared to a particular ecology. And the people who should guide those processes are people who know that ecology from, you know, their fingertips onwards.
Okay, last round.
Right.
Yes, please.
Binay Panda from Jawaharlal Nehru University here. Thank you, wonderful to hear you. As much as the savages and the gloomy days being true, but it is equally true that we are living in the most peaceful century. Look at the data. Look at just simply the data, not the Imperial, but the data. The indices in front of you in terms of hunger, human life expectancy, number of diseases, in all account, the most recent 3 centuries before us, where the history was written voraciously, we are living in a peaceful era. I'm not saying the savages are not true, the gloomy days are not true, but comparatively, we are much better off today in terms of the number of people killing each other, the deaths, human life expectancy, amount of life lost due to diseases. How do you reconcile these two facts, that we are in the midst of killing each other at the same time, we actually are better off purely looking at the data, which is true?
Okay, yes, please.
Hello, my name is Indranil Seth, and my question to Amitav as an author, I've read your fictions, I've read your non-fictions. Fictions written on cyclones, poppies, indentured laborers and all. And now this topic of the issues faced by the world. So what made you as an author to switch? I mean, I think you still write on fiction, but you're writing more on non-fiction these days. Is that true? And if that's true, what made you switch? Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, Amitav. I have a double question, one which has a bit of despair, the other one a bit of hope.
Please identify yourself.
My name is Ranjit. Yeah. With the growth in tribalism and nationalism, Russia, China, the US, etc., where do you think the trajectory will get a lot worse, given your historical knowledge? And the second is, do you think the best way to spread awareness about climate disaster is through fiction, TV series, OTT series, novels, etc., movies?
Okay. Amitabh, you have the...
Well, the first question, well, as they say, you know, the turkey thinks it has a wonderful, magical life, and then suddenly there's Thanksgiving. And, you know, and I mean, the data sets you're talking about have been thoroughly debunked. You know, I'm not a statistician, so I'm not going to get into that. But again, let me say that, you know, the people in Los Angeles thought that they had the best life in the world. Then suddenly one day, it's not such a good life anymore. Your question was about fiction and non-fiction. Yeah, I've always written a lot of fiction, non-fiction, you know. I mean, I began my career as a journalist at the Indian Express, you know, on Badshah Zafar Marg. So that habit has always stayed with me of, you know, watching the world and, you know, taking notes. So I've always enjoyed writing non-fiction. And, you know, if you're a writer, you know, making your living as a writer, you have to be willing to do lots of different things. And I've always enjoyed that process, you know, switching between fiction and non-fiction. Is the best way to reach people through poetry and novels and so on? I really don't think that we should think about it in that kind of instrumental way. You know, you can't reduce the process of writing to creating propaganda. You know, it just doesn't work like that. And this is a real problem, you know, because often, you know, my scientist friends will say, oh, we need you storytellers. But what they think is that, you know, they're going to tell us what the story is, and then we have to put it into words, which is ridiculous. Why should I do that? I have my own way of thinking about things. I don't think it's for me to tell people, you do that, you do that. It just doesn't work like that, you know. If this is indeed the greatest crisis mankind has ever faced, there'll be like 100 million different points of view. And there should be.
Okay, so we have now come to the end of this evening. You will all agree that this has been extremely stimulating interaction that we have had. So please give him a very, very big hand. Yeah, okay. Yeah. So I will now request our director to please deliver a vote of thanks. And before he does that, let me just inform you that copies of this book are available outside this hall. And would you be ready to sign some? And Amitabh would be ready to sign some of the copies. Okay. Okay.
It's outside.
Outside. Okay.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. 129 years ago on this day, Dr. Chintamani Dwarkanath Deshmukh, founder president of India International Center, was born. Apart from being a renowned economist and administrator, he was also a botanist, horticulturist, and linguist. He has a brilliant scholastic and academic career. Every year, we organize this memorial lecture to remember him and pay our tribute to him. We invite an eminent personality to deliver the memorial lecture. In the recent years in the past, the memorial lecture was delivered by Justice M.N. Venkatchalaya, Ambassador Maharaj Kishan Rasgotra, Professor Romila Thapar. This year, our board decided to invite Sri Amitav Ghosh to deliver this lecture. He very kindly accepted our invitation and has delivered this lecture today on a thought-provoking topic, times of monsters, times of possibility. I, on behalf of the entire IISc family, thank Sri Ghosh profusely for sparing his valuable time and delivering this memorial lecture today. Thank you, Mr. Ghosh. We look forward to Sri Ghosh's more visit to our center in future. I thank our President, Ambassador Shyamsaran, past President Sri N.N. Bohra, and all trustees and executive committee members for their support in organizing this event. I thank you all, ladies and gentlemen, for your gracious presence. Thank you. Jai Hind.